Well, hello everybody. My name is Brianna McWilliam, and I am a licensed and board-certified creative arts therapist, author, and educator. And I help adults struggling with insecure attachment go from feeling self-doubting to self-sovereign and calling in those soul-shaking, passionate partnerships that they want. And today I am so excited because we have a wonderful guest presenter, Dr. Usha Tummala-Narra, who has agreed to join us here today to talk about the impact of cultural competence and intersections of oppression as it pertains to our attachment styles and relationships. And to give you a proper introduction, Dr. Tummarla-Narra is a professor of counseling, developmental, and educational psychology at Boston College. She's also in independent practice in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Her research and scholarship focuses on immigration, trauma, race, and cultural competence in psychoanalytic psychotherapy. She has served as the chair of the Multicultural Concerns Committee and member at large on the board of directors in American Psychological Association Division 39, Psychoanalysis, and as a member of the APA Committee on Ethnic Minority Affairs, the APA Presidential Task Force on Immigration, and the APA Task Force on Revising the Multicultural Guidelines. Dr. Tummarla-Narra is an associate editor of the Asian American Journal of Psychology, associate editor of the Psychoanalytic Dialogues, and senior psychotherapy editor of the Journal of Humanistic Psychology. She's a fellow of the American Psychological Association and with APA Division 39 and Division 45. She's the author of Psychoanalytic Theory and Cultural Competence in Psychotherapy. This one, y'all need to go out and get it. And this is by APA Books. This was published in 2016, and her forthcoming edited book, Trauma and Racial Minority Immigrants, Turmoil, Uncertainty, and Resistance, will also be published by APA Books in January 2021. So I am very excited and happy to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Brianna. Nice to be here.
And so I thought what we might do, I'm going to ask you 3 to 4 broad questions just to sort of acclimate my audience to the topic. And then I thought we could transition into asking more specific questions that a few members of my online community posed.
That sounds good.
So my first question to you would just be, where would you begin in talking about the impact of culture on attachment styles and adult relationships, and maybe even our intimate relationships specifically?
Mm-hmm. The issue of attachment is such an important one in all different cultural contexts. Let me just start by saying that this is something that I think in every context, particularly in terms of parenting, intimate relationships, and friendships, that these are important matters no matter where you go in this world. If we bear that in mind, that it's a universal type of idea, that we need that human connection, that the quality of those connections matter deeply to us. We also have to kind of think about, well, how do different contexts understand how that kind of quality relationship develops? And to me, culture and context matter deeply when it comes to defining what secure attachment might actually look like and how it might develop. We've had sort of a change in psychology, I would say about 20 years ago in the early 2000s, when there were researchers who started to kind of question how we conceptualized attachment and how secure attachment is actually attained and developed. And some researchers and theorists arguing that, in fact, we have used Western Euro-American kind of norms to define what healthy relationships look like and feel like. And so we've begun, a process of really looking deeper into that and seeing, in fact, that you can have relationships that might look to somebody from a different cultural background as though that they are not functioning well or not well enough. And at the same time, within that cultural context, they're quite satisfying and fulfilling. So, this is why having a cultural lens, a contextual lens, matters a great deal when we're thinking about attachment and relationships.
And that actually leads me to my next question is, you mentioned that there's a questioning of what are the tenets of how we are even conceptualizing attachment. And So I find myself wondering, do you encounter resistance or do you encounter some um, flack maybe for suggesting that? And how do you experience that and why do you think that might be?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that there's a pull within our field, certainly in the mental health fields, to develop a broad understanding of human life and human behavior. And I think what sometimes happens is that we draw back on that position of we must be more alike than different. And certainly we are in some respects, but in other respects, we have very different viewpoints and very different life experiences. So, for example, if sometimes we don't recognize that we are socialized very differently based on our cultural backgrounds, our racial backgrounds. And, given the current events that, we're dealing with right now in the United States, and which are longstanding problems in the US and globally around race, for example, um, you know, uh, many families who are ethnic minority, racial minority families have discussions about race. And those discussions shape how a person views their interactions with other people, views, the kinds of things that they have to pay attention to be safe in the external world. And whereas many white families are not socializing their children to be thinking about race actively or even speaking about it. In fact, in some families, in many families, it's seen as a taboo subject. This is something that we don't talk about because it might offend somebody or it's not a nice thing to talk about. So right there is one important example of how, socialization in these very different contexts um, and the values that you're passing on generationally around this particular issue of race actually has implications for attachment, has implications for our sense of being in the world and in relation to others. And yet we have, since race is such a traumatic issue, certainly in the United States, that we have a hard time talking about it and engaging with it in an honest way,
Mhm.
whether we're in the context of an intimate relationship or in broader, context as well. So there is some defensiveness, and resistance that comes to talking about these issues because they do involve discomfort, sometimes pain and trauma as well.
And that actually leads right into my next question was in your book, you raised the term post-colonization stress disorder. And I was wondering if you might describe what that is a little bit, and also if you feel that that has a relationship to some of the gaps that we might see in the way attachment theory or attachment styles are applied in this context.
Sure. Yeah. Post-colonization stress disorder is something that it was a term that was coined by a psychologist named Lillian Gomez Diaz, and who's an amazing multicultural psychologist, a feminist psychologist, and she distinguished the experiences of many people of color with regard to racial trauma and socio-political trauma and its impact on intrapsychic and interpersonal experiences. And she distinguished this from PTSD or complex PTSD because she really sees this as a disorder of society itself, and rather than a disorder that lies within an individual, who carries that diagnosis of PTSD, for example. And so post-colonization stress disorder refers to um, the ways in which people have to negotiate identity in the context of not always feeling safe, not always feeling like they belong. They might experience fragmentation in terms of their identities and how they sort of have to perform or function in different contexts. And often leaving feelings of helplessness. So some things that you might see in what we call traumatic stress more broadly, but also some things very distinct about racial and sociopolitical trauma that over time and over generations also have have some sustained meanings for people. So that's really what that is referring to, and I think it adds a tremendous amount of thinking to how we conceptualize trauma more generally and post-traumatic stress.
Sure. And I was wondering if in your book you offer a few examples. I was wondering if you might be able to share like a case study or a story that illustrates how the intersections of oppression, or you also used a term racial melancholia, or that how the intrapsychic also impacts the interpersonal. And I was wondering if you might have an example that you could share about a story of how that might impact us on like the intimate level.
Sure. There was one case that I wrote about was the case of a client who I call Amaro. And when I met him, he was in his mid-50s, and he had adult children. He was married to his wife. He had immigrated from Chile, and he uh, had a very successful work life, and he was struggling. And when he entered therapy, he was seeking help for his grief, dealing with grief. He had lost a relative, an uncle. He had also been struggling with his mother's diagnosis of cancer. But the work sort of led into processing more about his romantic relationship, his emotional relationship with his wife, who he sort of felt was distant from him. And his wife, while her parents were were from Chile, she was raised primarily in Europe, in Italy, and she was more comfortable with Italian language than Spanish, which he was more comfortable with. And post-immigration, he noticed over the course of time, and I have to emphasize that this was a gradual process of his own recognition of what was happening in his relationship, that he felt more and more distant, like he wasn't like his wife, or that she wouldn't really understand his experience of being from Chile and his family and his background. And he missed the ability to speak in Spanish. He had very few spaces in the particular place where he lived. And he also internalized this sense that he shouldn't be speaking in Spanish, that he ought to be speaking in English in order to thrive in American society, that this was something that was not something that would be valued. And so one of the things that he really struggled with was this back and forth sort of fluctuation between idealizing and devaluing his culture of origin, his heritage culture, at times really missing his family and, being able to be a part more directly with his heritage culture and community. And then other times, finding it really hard to think about some of the more painful experiences that he did have growing up in Chile, which relates to attachment. And part of his attachment was certainly shaped by some of the negative messages that he received about his skin color. And he began to talk about colorism and how his darker skin color in comparison to his siblings and other people in his family was associated with something that was more devaluing. And then to come to the United States and be seen as a racial minority, a person who speaks with an accent and a lot of otherness, So all of these things in terms of how attachment changed over time were affected by the social context. The context was changing, the values were changing, and we had to kind of negotiate in our own relationship how he would talk about skin color with me. And he found it very painful to talk about it with me, particularly as I have darker skin color than him. And so it put us in this really interesting position to have to talk about something that was very uncomfortable, but still was really important. And to be able then to gradually communicate with his wife about things that he thought that she didn't want to hear, or that she, and the reality was that she was also feeling frustrated and anxious about the relationship, that he was pulling away from her, that he wasn't present with her. And so our ability to talk about this and the various social contextual forces that shaped his attachment and his intimate relationships was really necessary for him to be able to figure out how to do that with other people in his life, including his wife and his children. So that's an example that comes to mind.
Thank you for sharing that. It's a very helpful illustration. So I want to transition into asking maybe a few more specific questions. And these were questions that were posed by my online community. When I told them that I was going to be able to interview you, I asked what they might be curious about. And so these are just a few of those.